Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Dr. Alison Clark-Wilson, and I'd like to welcome you to this workshop this afternoon, which is part of the Enlighted Conference. And obviously, as a workshop leader, when you are asked to design and lead a workshop that is going to be wholly online, it always is challenging to find the best ways to make it interesting and participatory. So one of the things I'm going to encourage everybody is to speak up. Whatever voices we have in this medium, we must use them so that we can hopefully get to know each other a little and get some sense of a workshop environment that we would have if we were in the room together. So as I said, I'm Dr. Alison Clark-Wilson, and my full-time role is as an educational researcher in educational technology, and I'm based at UCL Institute of Education at our UCL Knowledge Lab, which is a hotbed of innovation and research around all things digital that impact on aspects of us as humans. And what I'm aiming to do in this workshop this afternoon is, as the name suggests, do some work together. We're going to be co-creating some resources that I hope are going to be useful to all of us in our future work. And we're going to be trying to grapple with this idea of impact. And the context for our impact is thinking about impact within education. And unsurprisingly, particularly with the world we're in right now, what are we thinking when we're designing digital educational innovations, interventions, resources, so that we maximize their impact? So we really look to the goals for which we're designing it and try to unpick the challenges around designing for impactful education. So I'm going to start by just outlining the workshop. And I'm going to highlight the digital tools that we're going to be using as well, because these are new environments for us all. And we're going to start just by thinking a little about who cares about impact. When we're thinking about measuring or evidencing impact, who are we evidencing it for and why? I'm going to conduct an online poll so I can get to know a little who is out there and who is in the workshop and find out a little more about you and you about each other. We're going to be using a Miro board. This is a collaborative space, and I'm going to be sending a link or putting a link on the screen as a call to action that's going to enable those of you in the workshop to hop into that space and work on some activities together. But we'll also be having that conversation in the chat as well. So you don't have to go out to the Miro board if you're only on one screen or it doesn't make sense, or you'd rather follow the session or the workshop in the chat. I've got a couple of pauses for questions, because I think it's really important that we pose questions as we go, and I will do my best to try to answer them, or at least problematize some of the issues that are raised by the topics that we're going to be talking about this afternoon. Now, my work, the particular work that I'm going to be relating to, is part of a project we've had at University College London called Educate. So I'm going to introduce you to that project, and I've got a short animation about the project to show you. And then give you a little bit of the data from that project, so you get a sense of the edtech companies that we've worked with, the sort of impacts that they've been designing their educational technologies to try to address. And then, because I work in a university, I'm a researcher. Today's focus on the Enlighted Conference is higher education institutions. I'm going to say a little bit about the research that we actually do, both at UCL Lab and beyond, across Europe, looking at education as what we're calling a design science. And I'll say a little bit more about that later, and then we'll have some follow-up questions there, I am sure. And I'm an action-oriented person, so I don't see the point in us doing this workshop if at the end of it there isn't a call to action to you, to all of us, to respond and take on some of the ideas that I'm going to be presenting. So let's start with that first question. Who actually cares about whether things have an impact? I always find it interesting. I've been in education a long time. I've been a teacher for many, many years. And I always find it interesting that very rarely do governments conduct impact evaluations of textbook schemes. And we know that the written textbook that have been in classrooms for hundreds of years, it's been a mainstay of the education world for a long, long time, and publishers, their industry depends on it, but rarely do we have a great scrutiny on whether these textbook schemes are effective or impactful. But somehow technologies come along and everyone's a little bit more critical. And it might be because we're slightly changing the status quo, or we might be slightly challenging the old norms in education. But clearly impact is a very important consideration. And if we start to think about who really cares about impact, well, undoubtedly, people like myself, academic researchers in research institutions, we learnt the tools of the trade of evaluating impact in the way that we understand research and how we use it to measure and evaluate interventions in education. So we definitely care, because it's a big part of our work to have that skill set and support others in the work that we do. But certainly over the years, and I'll say a little bit about myself in a moment, over the years, it's very obvious that particularly the emerging edtech enterprises who are grappling with designing their products and services and really trying to do that in a responsible, ethical and socially minded way also care about impact. The project I'm going to describe is one that brought these two groups together specifically to work on those aspects. Well, who else is really important here? Obviously, this technology is designed for use, and a good lot of it heads towards the formal education sector. That's our schools and universities. So the users of the educational technologies or the educational innovations are a really critical group here, particularly if those users are what we would say gatekeepers to learners. And obviously what's quite different about educational technology to other technologies like financial technologies and medical technologies and communications technologies is in education, the user is often not the person who is choosing to adopt a technology. It's often a school or an institution or somebody in between who pays, and you don't have the same relationship with your end users in education technology as you might do in other technologies. So there's some differences in the way the sector in educational innovation works in relation to how we would even go about gathering evidence that add a few extra challenges to the work that lies ahead of us. So there's three key groups, and you'll notice my very subtle golden triangle in the center there. I'm going to come to that a little later in the workshop. But if we just add in a few of the obvious other people in the ecosystem or in the wider community, governments and policymakers obviously care. They make huge decisions around educational spending, around the training of teachers, around some of the infrastructure that has to be in place for schools to take up particularly digital innovations. Governments and policymakers who really do seek evidence to make these decisions, in my experiences, are a key user group for the sort of evidence that we might want on educational impacts in relation to technology innovations. We've also got universities, partly because we are very much involved in the evaluation and research around the world. So we are a key interest party in this. Publishers, it's very interesting as publishers move from the traditional book text, paper-based text in education to other forms of digital media, have become increasingly interested in the ways that impact evaluations are conducted. Well-known publishers like Pearson's have whole research departments in their organizations where they're really trying to build out their new products for education in a way that is built on evidence of their impact even as they're being designed. So publishers not only employ lots of industry researchers, they are part of this really important picture, as is the industry in general. So if we think about the global technology industry, so, you know, we don't traditionally see big tech companies like Microsoft and Google as educational companies, but undoubtedly there is a big part of what they do now that feeds into education, and industry partners are also thinking about the impact of their work in the sector. I put investors in here because certainly in my most recent experience, there is a real growing interest in not just investing in technology that looks as though it's going to be profitable, which is obviously a key consideration for many, many investors, but there's also a much more philanthropic social investment arm, which is also interested in the value of the social good. And it's interesting in that in order to gain funding, particularly larger funding rounds with some of the more established investor communities, having some evidence of impact is a really valuable thing to include within your pitch, within your funding rounds, to really help investors make that discerning choice between an ed tech that is really going to realise the way that the potential of the technology that might be being developed. Moving on, accelerators and incubators. I worked for 2.5 years as part of the Educate Accelerator, which was at UCL. There are many, we've connected with many of them in our day-to-day work, many around the world. And what's interesting is they're not always educationally focused. So a lot of the innovation technology incubators and accelerators are more generic, and there is this interesting culture within education that means that impact evaluation and evidence in impact is something that is on the radar of entrepreneurs from an early stage. Again, in my experience, social entrepreneurs, people involved in educational developments and educational innovations, really do care about building products that are impactful. So the accelerators and incubators have a role in building the capacities for such entrepreneurs, those interested in educational impacts. And there are some tools around which I'm going to say a little bit more about at the end of the workshop. So coming to the end of this sort of global group, we've also got the corporates. There's a huge market for professional and corporate education, professional learning, and they in themselves produce, develop and innovate in that area, and are part of that evaluation story. So the corporates who can often be funding larger evaluations on tech platforms are a really key group. So the bottom line here is it is a collective responsibility. All of these different people have a part to play in thinking about what the evidence base for an educational innovation might be. And interestingly, they all want to see those results and findings in different ways. There's one group not there that are very critical. What about parents? And it's interesting in the current pandemic situation how for many parents who are trying to manage supporting their children's home learning, making choices around one particular educational innovation or technology over another is a really hard thing to do. And certainly academic colleagues at the Institute of Education in London developing apps and tools to help parents to make some of these more discerning choices, to think more about which sort of technology or innovation might be the right one for their children. And so parents are a very key group there. So that's the scene I'm setting, and the focus for this workshop is going to be really thinking about what this impactful evidence is needed for. What is it we're trying to evidence when we're looking to think about the impacts of any intervention. But let me just spend a moment to introduce myself a little bit more, and then I'd like to open it up to everybody in the workshop to say a little bit more about yourselves and what brings you here in that respect. So about me, I began life as a secondary maths teacher in England over 35 years ago, and I was unusual in that I did embrace technology in my teaching from the get-go. I was had quite a techie family. We were involved in technologies in other ways, and as soon as I could move from my paper-based log tables to my slide rule, I did. And as soon as I could move from my slide rule to the very first electronic calculator I had, I did it very quickly. And I've generally been an early adopter of most technologies as they come along. But what happened when I was a young teacher and I was asked to lead national projects around using graphing technologies at that time in school maths education, in some large pilots in the UK, I realized very early on that I was not the norm, and that not all of my colleagues, particularly in mathematics departments in secondary schools, could see a value in bringing technology into their work. And that led me on a journey, which I am still continuing, which is really an inquiry-based mindset. I'm a person who asks questions, and I'm a person who wants to grapple with the research methods to try to answer them. So going back to my classroom teaching experiences, I started by really sort of looking at realizing the potential of the technology and sharing stories from my classroom through conferences, through professional journals, just literally snapshotting activities I'd done with learners and trying to think a little bit more about why I thought they were having a really positive impact on their learning and their enjoyment of their learning, which is an important factor for me. So I was very sort of centered on my own classroom practice, but looking at how what I was doing was impacting on the learners around me. Moving on from that, sort of fast forward 10 years or so, and I'd moved out of the school setting into the university setting, where I was supporting the teacher development programs, so working on masters and trainee programs for school maths teachers in that context. And then I'm thinking about not how do we design the right sort of activities for children, but how do we design the right sort of activities for teachers to help them to get confident in the use of technology, to enable them to go anywhere near the classroom with a bit of technology in their hand. And that's not a trivial matter. If that had been easy, then all of those texts I've been using 30 years ago would have been in most of the maths classroom around the world. And that isn't the case. So thinking about, what does it take to bring these innovations into classrooms and into lecture theatres and into the experience of formal learners is a non-trivial matter that I've spent my lifetime working on. So this idea of cross-national studies, of thinking about how do we sustain and scale up, although it might not be your worry when you're going out there with your early stage innovation ideas and you're thinking about how you might develop a business and develop a product, you can't not have in your mindset somewhere that scaling and sustaining the uptake of that tech is actually a very hard challenge to try to solve. And that's something that lots of research studies have borne out. Most recently, my work has been as part of Educate, and we've worked with hundreds of edtech companies in the London context. I'm going to say a little bit more about that later, but that really has given me a much deeper insight into the other side of the coin, if you like, the challenges of the entrepreneurial scene, where we're really trying to look at the problems that are in the education system right now, propose that solutions which may or may not involve technologies, and then look at how we build sustainable businesses that can then do something around that particular problem or issue. So I'm going to put a questionnaire up in a moment, but what I'd like to do is get a sense of who's out there. And I've got a few categories, and it doesn't matter if you don't fit, because I'm going to invite you to say a little bit more about yourself into the chat. So just if you haven't found it, you've got a public chat area on your screen. Please use it. I'd like to know who you are, where you are, and what brings you here. And I'm going to start the poll now. So one sec, let's get that going. And you should see some questions come up on your screen, and I'm going to leave it running for a couple of minutes, but just to run through the categories, you should, if my understanding of the way this poll works, be able to choose more than one response. If that doesn't end up being the case, then please pick the category that you most relate to. And if you don't feel you fit in any of those categories, then please do tick other and let me know in the chat. So really like to know who's out there. It will help me to tailor this session. I am definitely a teacher who likes to know as much about my group as possible, so that I can tailor what we do to your particular interests. So as these votes are coming in, I can see about a quarter of you have voted, so I'm going to encourage those of you who are not sure, and do put other, and do just write in. So great, we've got some PhD students. Hello, Marissa, welcome to you. Like to tell us where you are and what, very interested to know what your PhD is about. We're nearly there, just a couple more votes coming in, and it's great. We've got teachers and lecturers, got some entrepreneurs, some university people, some other researchers. I love that. I knew I'd have an educational visionary out there. Please reveal yourself, whoever you are. Research and service designer, Farah. Be interesting to hear more about what that role involves. So that's great. I think we've got a couple more votes to come in, or there's messages coming in. And I'm going to end the poll in 10 seconds. And I can see we're a very tight group here. So I'm going to share the results with you. And that's very helpful. So we've got, what's really nice about this is we've got a good mix of the community that I was mentioning earlier. So hopefully when we come to the next task, which is going to take you off into Miro board, you'll be able to share some of your knowledge and expertise, or it will come through when we look at that. So let's go back to the presentation, and I'm going to move on to the next task, which we're going to be working in a collaborative space. I'm going to say a little bit about it before we go there. But what I'd like to do is really pose the question to you as a group of workshop participants around what for you is an educational impact. So when we talk about something having an educational impact, what are the sort of descriptors that you come up with? I know the language of my world of educational research. I'm really interested in what it means to you for something to have an educational impact. What or who is it impacting on? Okay, and we've got a lot more that we're going to unpick about this, but let's start with some ideas from you. Now, if I had a thumbs up function, I don't think we do here, which is a shame. I would ask you how many of you are familiar with Miro, which is a cloud-based collaborative tool that can be used for lots and lots of different purposes, educational, business, that allows us to basically all pop off to a share doc, which isn't a Google Doc with text. It's a much more interesting looking post-it note board environment, where I'm going to send you the link and invite you to pick a card, and you will pick a card by clicking on it, and then you will be able to type into that card any particular thoughts you have around educational impacts. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to put a call to action up on the screen. And when you get the call to action, there'll be a live link for those of you who are in the workshop session to click on that link, and you'll be able to see go straight to the board. I've got another screen here. I'm going to see you in there. But for those of you who aren't in a Miro mood, and it isn't for everybody, really happy that you post your responses straight into the chat. There's a great advantage for that, because we have a YouTube audience who are also working, and it means for those people who are still in this room as opposed to our Miro space, I'm going to be able to still provide some input and have some discussion around the sort of impacts that you are generating. Okay, so your minds are now going to be on educational impact. There's a call to action coming on the screen right now, and it's going to be up there for 3 minutes, it says, for some reason. So it's going to be there for 3 minutes. So please, if you are viewing the workshop, there's a turquoise blue banner come up at the top of the screen, and what you need to do is click on join the Miro board. It's not password protected, and I can see already a good number of you in there. Now, if you're going to stay here in this workshop space, what I'd like you to do is post your thoughts around educational impacts into the chat, and then I can use some of those ideas with the people who are watching on the live stream. So going to spend about 10 minutes on this task, because what I'd like to do is generate a lot of ideas onto the Miro board, and then use those ideas to feed the work that we're going to do next. So while ideas are appearing on the screen next to me, and I can see quite a few people in there now, we have some guest artisans, Miro heroes, sculptors with some amusing names in there, and people should be clicking and adding their ideas. So you find a post-it note, double click on it, and it will enable you to text edit it. And I can see there's lots of ideas. So straight away, I can see Farah's contributed, know what is working and what is not so. So an impact of an innovation might be that you would be able to understand that. I might ask Farah to say a little bit more about that one. Thank you, Marisa. You've put one into our chat here, which says, collaborative education makes better students and better citizens. So that's interesting, Marisa, because what you've offered there is a hypothesis. In my view, as a researcher, you're making a claim that collaborative education makes better students and better citizens. So I'm going to pose this out to others in the workshop to respond in the text if you're still in the workshop environment, and maybe question Marisa on what she means by either better students or better citizens, because they're two different groups or classifications of people, and what makes a better citizen, we might need to know that in order to know how on earth we were going to design an evaluation study to understand whether this collaborative education is impacting on young people to help them make better citizens. So what does better mean in this context, Marisa? Maybe you can give us a few ideas, or maybe you can expand it on the Miro board. I'm looking over onto the Miro board, and I can see that there's an impact, which is being able to extrapolate. Okay, so even if I just take those words, being able to extrapolate, my first question is, who are we talking about here? Are we talking about professional scientists? Are we talking about primary school learners? Are we talking about adult learners in a technical setting? But obviously being able to extrapolate is something that we might want to look to evidence in the particular intervention that we might be designing. But to drill down on that, we need to know a little bit more about which particular group this impact was being aimed on. Now, I'm going to take a second level to the task that's going on in the Miro board now, which is each of those ideas for impact that are already there has attached to it some tags, and if you click on the card, you'll see the little tag functionality, and it will let you choose the particular learner types that you think might be appropriate for that impact, because what we've got over here on the right is a whole host of things, and they're an interesting set. So enhances creativity, develops accountability in students, opens possibilities, creates new languages to connect, improves attitudes to learning was my starter for 10 that I put on the board, motivating learners to want to learn, in other words, developing agency and learner agency. These are all very, very valid first thoughts around impacts. So I've got a couple more minutes. I'm going to give you about another 3 minutes on that task. And I'm going to try and push you a little bit on the sort of text that you've got going on there, because one of the ways in which we talk about evaluating research is there are other words that get used within our language set. So if I also use the word output, outcome, and impact, they're all words that are in the same sort of genre, if you like, of research language, but they have very, very different meanings in some of the ways that we design evaluation studies. And one of the ways that we think about impact can often be the really big thing that you want to see differently at the end of your intervention, which would usually be over certainly weeks, months, years, rather than maybe days, hours, or just lessons. So impacts by their name are generally the bigger end goal, and they can often be at a societal level. So very interesting in that Marissa, who's just clarified on her point around our her intentions for better students and better citizens, that can be a very societal goal to produce better systems. We could say all of our education systems are aiming towards better citizens, more educated citizens as a whole. It's a huge thing to try to unpick. So, these impacts are often very aspirational, and they can be quite challenging to try to unpick how you would tell the story from the intervention that you might be putting into the system right through to whether or not you've achieved your goal with the impacts that you were designing that intervention for. So we are getting a host of ideas on the Miro board, and in a moment I'm going to ask those of you who are simultaneously there to bring your attention back to the main screen. And this is an interesting thing, because in a real classroom it's very easy to do this, but apart from killing the editing functionality on the Miro board, I'm just going to have to trust you to come back. But this is the difference sort of mediation of an online environment. But if you can push your attention across, what I'd like to do is just pause to take some questions, really around challenges that we're facing in trying to just work out what we mean by impact, the word impact. So I'm going to pause for Q&A, and I'm going to open up the Q&A functionality, or one of my great enlightened tech colleagues is going to, let me see, check how I do this. Okay, so I'm enabling the Q&A mode at this point. And what I'd really like you to do is to start to pose questions around just trying to make sense of impacts, and where I think these questions might come from. As you look at what other people have written on the Miro board, what does that make you think about the way that you are understanding and conceiving the idea of impact? So there's some quite different types of words going on there. So contributing to developing future humanistic leaders. Okay, so my first question, if I was posing a question around that one, is what's the impact? Okay, so contributing to as a set of words, but the impact is what? What about developing future humanistic leaders? So what's the quality of a future humanistic leader that you might want to develop? So in all cases, it's unpicking a little bit what you mean by the terminology in the words that you're phrasing your impact. So I can see another impact here. Sets teachers as creators. Okay, so if we think then about what that might mean, set teachers as creators, as an impact, what comes to mind? So if a teacher was a creator, what would be different about their practice? What is it in their behaviors? How would you know that a teacher was a creator? I mean, I would argue most teachers are creating their lessons most days. They are all creators. So I'm not so sure teachers aren't creators yet. I think that particular person has a view on what they mean around teachers as creators. And I think that would be really interesting to hear more about. And at this point, I'm going to just check with my conveners if we are able to switch on the microphone functionality. Saima, are you there? Are we able to invite people to speak?
Hi, Alison. I'm here.
No?
You are not available, but if you tell me who would you like to invite to talk,
Yes.
I activate them.
That would be lovely. Okay. So, I mean, I would love to invite Marisa in because I think she's got very interesting ideas there around collaborative education. So, Marisa, would you like to say a little bit more about the particular impact that you offered into our workshop?
Now you can.
That's lovely. Thank you. So, I think, Marisa, I can release you to speak. And hello, Marisa. I'll give you one more go, Marisa.
Oh.
Okay.
Marisa, you are on mute. You can talk now.
Oh, she has a problem with the audio. That's no problem. Okay. And we have a question, where can the Q&A be seen? So let's just sort this out. Let's try and get the Q&A functionality. That is enabled. So I'm hoping that you are able to post your questions in the Q&A right now. So the first question in the Q&A, I love it, Farah, is where can we see the Q&A? I hope you can see it down on the right. In your chat window, there should be another tab there for Q&A. Okay, well, in that case, I think I will ask you to put your questions in the chat, might be the easiest, and we'll have another opportunity later on to take Q&A, but I really would like to encourage you to send your Q&A. And meanwhile, I can see many more ideas appearing on the Miro board with some really interesting impact statements. I'm going to go back to the presentation and take you on a little bit further in the story. So, as I mentioned, a good part of the work that we've done at the University College London is working with educational technology and educational entrepreneurs. And I'm going to show a short video about our project before we take those ideas on a little bit further. So, over to the video. The first question we need to ask when developing new EdTech is what educational problem the EdTech aims to address. There are many innovative ideas in education, particularly involving new technologies. However, it can be really hard for EdTech designers to know if their innovations are going to lead to desirable educational outcomes. Whilst designers are often hopeful that their product will make a tangible impact, many need support to know how to engage with educators and learners to get their perspectives. That's where Educate comes in. Educate is the leading research accelerator program for EdTech companies. The program is led by Professor Rose Luckin, Dr. Mutlu Kukarova, and myself, Dr. Alison Clark-Wilson. We're all educational researchers at UCL's Institute of Education, UK. Our solution is the Golden Triangle. The Golden Triangle brings together the people who design EdTech with the people who use it and the people who know how to research whether it achieves the educational outcomes that are claimed. The methodology underneath the Golden Triangle is the program of research, training and mentorship for EdTech entrepreneurs to help them to understand how research evidence can help them build their product in research-informed ways, drawing on the learning sciences. Also, we help them to understand how to begin to research whether or not their product is addressing the educational need for which it is being designed. In all cases, the entrepreneurs are designing for some educational impact, but how do they know if they achieve that impact? And that's where the research training comes in. Now, EdTech innovators all over the world can join our growing community that aims to produce marketable, profitable, and transformative EdTech products that are powered by evidence.
Alison, you are mute.
Thank you. So I'll start again there. The animation that you saw there was produced by a startup in the education space that wanted to look at how they could help researchers communicate their research ideas to a wider audience. So right across the landscape, we've got really innovative companies and entrepreneurs who are spotting these little problems and issues in our systems and proposing solutions for them. So let me say a little bit more about Educate, and then I'd like to spend a bit of time talking about our methodology. It was all very loosely talked about there in the animation there. But between 2017 and 2019, as I said, at UCL Institute of Education, we had a project which was funded by the Greater London Authority, that's the municipality of London, to support 252, as it happened, small and medium-sized enterprises in 12 cohorts, and these companies came on to work with my team of 12 research mentors who then helped to both teach research methods, but it was a very pragmatic, practical course because we used a couple of tools, which I'll say a little bit more about, to help the companies design their own small scale, and I would say agile research method to go away and try to evaluate one piece of the bigger project that they were developing. What we found in our 252 companies were they were at very different stages of development. So some of them had products that were out there with, quite significant numbers of users, even though the companies themselves might only have been 20 or 25 employees, and they may not have great turnover yet. They were still gaining lots of users. And what we worked with them to do was to help them to understand better themselves what the impacts were that they were designing their innovation to try to achieve, and then to work through in quite a systematic, logical way how they would know whether or not they'd achieved those particular goals. And that means thinking about some of the assumptions they had in their design of the technology and how it was going to be used, some of their assumptions around how their users would engage with it, right through to the sort of data that they would need to collect to try to understand and validate some of those assumptions. And the research training that we adapted, we have a master's in educational technology at UCL, and we adapted our research methods course quite substantially. The two main adaptations were there wasn't a requirement to read a lot of academic papers, and they certainly didn't need to produce any written assignments. But what they did learn was the methodologies and the tools of the trade, if you like, to help them to design their own small research project. And that was one of the goals of their engagement in the Educate program. And as I say, the main goal here was help the enterprises to become more research-minded, more research-informed in the way that they went about things. So the next slide I'm going to put up is a top-level analysis of the company's impact goals that the research team then refined and worked on over the period of the project. And I'll say a little bit about our own research methodology, but by the time we finished this project, we had rather an impressive list of impacts that the companies had come up with that their products and services were aiming to address. And I think there's a couple of things I want to say about the way that we've expressed these impact goals here. Building on ideas in Bloom's taxonomy would be the sort of research base for this. Using an action verb in an impact statement is a really good strategy. So if we look at all of the way these impacts are phrased, and I'll say again, these aren't what came out of the mouths of our EdTech entrepreneurs. This was very much how the research team synthesized and put these ideas alongside each other. But what we definitely saw were that these action verbs then really indicated something that could be in some ways at least defined and hopefully measured in some way. So if we take something like prepare for work, now straight away there's an intended user in there. Quite interestingly, you might find a product aimed for primary children to prepare them for the world of work, thinking about their aspirations and what they might want to do there. You might find a product that was helping to prepare university students for the world of work. So interestingly, in all of these cases, there's an intended user somewhere. It's not explicit here at all. So these are very top-level impact goals. The very common ones were improve attainment, but then you would get more subtle ones, which might be improve girls' attainment, improve boys' attainment, and then there's an in something that isn't here. So these are very generic in the way they're expressed, but it's a good set of words to help you to think about what is the difference, what is it that you want to see that is different at the end of your intervention. And usually that's because we're talking about interventions with humans here in learning situations, it needs to be some tangible change to something around that particular setting. So something around thinking through the words, choosing the words carefully, I would say, when you're starting to think about impacts is a really important starting point to then being able to track back as to quite how measurable or evidenceable they are, because every single one of them written here is still not sufficiently defined. So if I say improve educational equity, okay, so that means we're trying to close the gap between one group of learners and another group of learners who probably historically underperform against some metric. Now, if it's improve educational equity for preschoolers around language development, it's a very, very different thing to improving educational equity if we're looking at balancing, say, the diversity of students going to very traditional universities. So in all cases, there's a context wrap around these impacts, and that's where you get to the nuances of how are you going to think about your particular intervention or innovation, and it actually leading you through to that particular impact. But it helps to start with some carefully chosen words that you can define, and that's the important thing. Now, one thing we do find is that there's often multiple impacts. So you're not designing for just one. And if I took the example here, I think I can think of a particular product that or company that was part of our project. They had a product which ultimately wanted to redress aspects of educational inequality for children starting school, but their actual product was aimed at parents to improve parenting. And this is where, you know, the impacts might not be directly evidenceable. One might need to happen before the next thing can actually be an impact. And this is where it gets complicated, because the chain from your intervention through to the impacts you need, you won't see an impact on the children until you've seen an impact on the parents. So in some ways, you don't need to even look at the children's impacts yet, because you need to know your product's working in the hands of the parents. And this is where we often see big studies essentially wasting a resource, because there were a few things along the way that needed to be in place before it was worth looking to see whether we had any impacts on the learners at the end. So at this point, I will just look back to the chat, because I would really like you to encourage you to challenge me on some of the things that I'm saying here around impacts. Maybe you have different experiences, maybe you bring different perspectives on this, particularly anyone. I noticed we had some policy, government, NGOs who, you know, for whom measuring and evaluating impact is a really key part of your role. What are some of the challenges that you face in your world? And perhaps you can indicate in the chat if you're willing to, if you are willing to put on your mic and say a little bit more. I'd really like to invite some people to speak here if we can. So let me pause for a moment and give you a chance to think about challenges around either defining impacts or measuring impacts that you face in your day-to-day roles. And either post a Q&A, or if you're willing to say something, please indicate in the chat and our wonderful enlightened colleagues can switch on. I'm going to pause and give people a moment. Meanwhile, I can still see impacts going on there. You might want to go back and amend an impact you wrote earlier. Thank you, Farah. Farah, would you be prepared to speak a little on this? It'd be interesting to know your context and why this is a challenge for you. Thank you, Farah. So, Saima, if you can unlock the power for Farah to speak. We shall get you on.
Farah, you are ready to talk.
Thank you. Hello, Farah. Maybe we're not doing very well on this, are we? Farah, do you want to try to speak? Yes, there does seem to be an issue. That's a real shame. Yeah, sorry about that. But I did see it as it pop up to let me see, Farah, you're in the group. Wonderful. Okay, in that case, I will abandon trying to get your involvement through chat, and that means we're going to have to push it all through the Q&A channel. So that, just moving on then. What I'd like to do now, this next set of slides, I'm going to start with this is where I have to the presentation workshop. I don't know if you room the workshop, because having a really workshop, you can have built up these ideas over at least 15 minutes. And right now, I'm going to teach you so we'll be thinking about and the right hand side of the image. You can see the way that we do I'm pausing and coming back to you, Simon. Are you hearing me okay? Yes? Good. Thank you. I'm really sorry that the sound is a challenge. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Right, I shall carry on. So on the screen is something that is known as a logic model. And as system thinking, systematic thinking is something that is very much to be encouraged when we're trying to think in a very sort of evaluatory way about things. So I'd like to just focus on the orange, the last part of this diagram, which is what we've started off by talking about, impacts. And the question on this card says, what changes in organizations, communities, or systems occur? And that's really the level at which impacts are thinking about, is what's the really big thing that you want to look different or be different by putting your educational innovation or technology out into the world. And it's that change that is really critical, because ultimately we're looking to measure in some way that change. So what happens when we're working with our educational technology companies is we start with the impacts, because that's what drives entrepreneurs and innovators. They want to change something. They go in with that mindset, and then they often have an idea which may be technological, it might not be, or they found people who've got ideas on the technology side who say, well, we could do this, we could build this, we could make this. So the idea is that on the right hand side you've got the impacts, but at the other end, at the beginning of the chain, you've got the thing you're inputting into the system. So this is the resource, it might be the tech, it might be a teaching idea, it might be all sorts of things that you want to put in to that system to try to bring about that change. Now, what happens in the middle is the really challenging area, because we put our things into the system because we want the users, we want the people we're designing it for to do things. We want them to do activities, whether it's an activity on an app, whether it's an activity in a real classroom, all sorts of activities that humans do in the learning process. And you're hoping that you're going to stimulate certain sorts of activities as a result of your input. So if you think of, you create something, you put it into this system, people do things with it, okay? And then what happens is stuff happens. Stuff gets generated, data points get sort of logged in places, and things might get written or spoken, or children might do things together, or students might collaborate on a task. But the outputs are what happens as a result of the activity. So if you imagine you've got all these little outputs, and they're all different. You've got techie outputs, you've got human social outputs, chat and collaboration and all sorts of things that might go on. You've got things that go on away from a tech as well, which can be very challenging to get a sight of. So all of these outputs are generated, and they become things that could be proxies for the impact that you're looking for. And if we think about the traditional proxy, we're thinking about learning often. What's a good proxy for learning? Getting questions right on quizzes is a proxy for learning. Having a really productive chat conversation about something that's been introduced to you is a proxy for learning. So we have all these different ways that we get a picture of learning. No one of these methods give you a whole picture. And having been in educational research for my lifetime, there is no one of those that will ever be there. Humans are far too complicated. Learning is far too complex, and the learning situation, and we're all too unique for that. So we have to make a best guess at what the right proxies for those outputs are that would then let us think, yes, this thing's having an impact in the way I'm designing. So let's come to the next word. And I mean, I'm an English first language speaker. I have a bit of an advantage to the nuances in understanding these words, but outputs and outcomes are very, very different in the way we define them here. So if we think of an output as a single metric measure, like taking a temperature, an outcome is when you can actually measure a change in those outputs over time. So let me give you a really simple intervention that everyone will understand, okay? You have a bit of a flu, and you have a temperature, and your input is an aspirin or a paracetamol. which you take. So the input is the tablet, the activity is to take it, the output is your temperature, okay? And if you took your temperature every hour over the next 8 hours, you might see the outcome that your temperature reduces, okay? And your overall impact could be millions of people around the world can reduce their temperatures by taking a particular drug. Now, we love medical analogies because in some ways it's so easy for us to see what metrics are in a biological sense. Go back to my learning scenario, it's not quite so easy. So trying to think of what are the right outputs, trying to think about whether a change in that output is an outcome that you want to actually measure. These are all the very difficult things that we have to think about. So it all looks really complicated. So let me bring you back down to ground and think about scenarios that we definitely know things about. So I just picked the fact that teachers in the UK actually do this every day. They carefully select resources and activities for their learners. They give these activities to their students, and hopefully the students engage with the resources they're given. The outputs are that the teachers watch the children at work and collect in their heads and collect through their eyes and ears and through the things that children do, what happens in the activity themselves. And then they look over time, week on week, month on month, year on year, and through a whole host of output measures, begin to conclude that most children make some learning progress over time. And impacts can be all sorts of things because it really depends on what the context that we are here. So this sort of theory of change logic model approach sort of fits with the way that humans engage in educational settings. Interestingly, for our UK teachers, one of the challenges is they only see children for a little part of their life, actually. So, you know, you might only teach a child for a year or two in their lifetime, and then you never actually see what the real outcomes are. And you certainly rarely see what they go on to do in later life when they've left school, gone to university, got work, whatever they do. So there are many things in this system that we don't know. But that's where at the education system level, we know generally what school education looks like, and we can generally use the outcome measures that the state decides on to decide if we're having a positive impact in an education system as a whole. So that's the micro of the teacher doing their lessons every day to the macro of the system. So a teacher couldn't possibly measure the impact of their teaching on a child's life, but they could think about it over a much shorter period of time. And that's a really critical thing to think about here, is that we need to be mindful over what time scale or timeline that impact might be achieved. Because another flaw as we start to try to design evaluation studies is that we're not really thinking about what's realistic. And this is because it's what we call in English a chicken and an egg situation. We need to have the resource designed and working well to take it away to do an evaluation of it, but we can't know if that evaluation is going to work without having done some trial and piloting of it in an earlier stage. And it's a very difficult one to try to understand. Back to our innovators and our educational entrepreneurs and our people with the ideas. So we've used this tool with all 252 companies inside our Educate program. And I can tell you, we took many hours to break down these elements and work individually with them with their particular innovation. So we weren't working at a theoretical level, a bit like we are here. We were thinking it from a very practical sense of how was that going to work for what did it look like for their particular company or product. So it takes time to get your head around what these things mean in the context that you might be working with. But what I want to do is just show you a typical route through for our innovators. So as I said, a lot of them, we start at both ends. We say, right, what's the product or idea that you've got in your input, and what are those big end goals that you're trying to achieve? And we work hard to try to understand those two things. And we don't really worry about what's in the middle yet. through design sprints. That's design sprints on their products and design sprints on thinking about their ultimate research project. We start to pin down the sort of inputs and the sort of activities that might arise from those inputs. Because if you haven't built the tech yet or built the innovation yet, you don't quite know what the activities are going to be. They go hand in hand. But in both cases, you've got assumptions. You've got assumptions about which users, what sort of context they're working in, what sort of technology they're going to be using, if there's going to be any adults or anyone around them to support them, all sorts of things that are your assumptions. And if all the assumptions are true, then you might be onto a good thing. So the assumptions are really important. And what we found was so many of the assumptions that our entrepreneurs were making were just not substantiated. It was what they thought, but they hadn't necessarily looked at research in that area or talked to users or gone out into the field to look at what tech was out there to really understand whether what they were proposing was even likely to generate the sort of activities that they were thinking about. So then what happened was it was sort of back to the drawing board. The assumptions were tested. They weren't quite right. So it was back to the design stage, start again. And this is normal in innovation and in entrepreneurial settings where you will agilely think through your assumptions, go and gather data and try to validate them so that you can understand where to go next. Hopefully we get going a little bit further, but again, you can build it, you can take it out and test it with users, and actually the data you get isn't what you were expecting. And this is a real issue because this data is the proxies that you've decided are for learning. And one of the things that we found in working in the educational technology sector was there wasn't enough attention to going out and observing users in real contexts using even the early stage technologies. Too much got built before the point where it was taken out and piloted in that sense. And this is something we've certainly found in the Educate program, is the opportunities for early stage designs to be taken out and piloted in safe environments where, you know, teachers and parents and learners are open-minded that they're working with something that is still in design, are really varied around the world. And certainly in my own work, coming across programs such as certainly the Finnish project, which is looking at evaluating educational technologies and designing them with different municipalities. Swedish EdTest is another organisation. There's now a growing number of organisations that are supporting this bridge for EdTech companies to be able to go and pilot their early stage designs with potential users and get really important data. So it goes on, and hopefully you get to the point where you have a reasonable chain of thinking that is going to take you from that technology that you've designed right through to those ultimate impacts. So I'm going to take a pause and I'm just going to check my chat because I'm not so good at multi-screening. Okay, so moving on. So on the last part of the session now, I want to just bring in some ideas and just posit that, you know, education as a design science. So teaching on an educational research methods course, you know, for many, many years, that there were only a clutch of educational research methods that were out there. We generally talked about experimental and exploratory studies, and we generally talked about qualitative studies and quantitative studies, and it was all a bit one or the other. You did one or the other, or occasionally you do a mixed methods and take parts of things to design something that was a little bit more flexible, perhaps, in the sort of data and the way that you went about collecting it. But one of the things, and it's a new research paradigm that has certainly emerged over the last 20 years, and it's really this sense of education as a design science has come about through a methodology called design-based methodology, design-based research methodology. And this really comes from the tech, interestingly, field within education, where all of these challenges I've just highlighted around around learning as you go and gathering data and research as you go is really critical to building robust products that will ultimately scale into education systems and bring about systemic change. So this education as a design science is really, how do we take what we know from the learning sciences? And I know my colleague Rose Lucking gave a plenary very much in this genre yesterday for the Enlightened Conference. But how do we take what we know in the design sciences and look at how we can develop more agile research methods that are still robust? And the robustness comes from being still systematic, still thinking about how educational theory helps and shapes what we do, but also documenting the methods in a way that can be communicated. So it's not a black box, these little design cycles and nobody knows what's going on inside them, but we all aim to make things explicit so that we can learn from both the process and the product. And the product is in some ways the product you're building, but the product is also what it tells us about learning, about educational technology, about the bigger things that we might be interested in. And if I reflect back on the Educate project and what we learned through our own design-based research, and I'll point you towards the end of the workshop at some of the readings and papers that we have available that say a lot more about this. But when we went into this project with 250 companies, with educational researchers learning how to collaborate and cooperate with edtech entrepreneurs, many of whom didn't have experience in each other's worlds, what we did learn is that it can be done, and that with the right sort of tools and logic models and research proposals are all important tools that we adopted. There is a blueprint for these ways of working. There definitely isn't a one-size-fits-all, and retrospectively on the program across the 252 companies, we could see now that there might be a very subtly different sort of program for smaller, earlier stage companies with maybe only a founder and a co-founder, or under 5 employees. A very different program for a company that might have 20, 25, 30 employees. And this is very much to do with the way that knowledge is distributed within the organizations and the way that everyone in the company can learn and apply sort of more research-informed methods in what they're doing. Having the right educational research experts is key. We had a lot of research mentors inside our program, and one of the things we needed was educational researchers with a very broad and open mind around what constituted research and what constituted evidence. So in some ways you could say the educational researchers in the university were sort of the authority figures, but we really weren't when it came to balancing the trade-offs between the way that you might conduct research inside an early stage company as opposed to what we might do as a researcher inside a project funded with millions of euros. So, we had to, on both sides, be humble in our knowledge to understand the contexts for which we were having those discussions. And it's not the right flavour for every educational researcher. Some researchers are wedded to their methods. They want to impose their research approaches on edtech companies, and that's not helpful for either. So the right educational research experts are key, and therefore there's a training and development arm of how do you build capacity inside the higher education sector to have those sorts of researchers who can still be the guardians of the methods, but at the same time open-minded enough to see where it's not going to be possible to apply those methods in such a rigorous way for an early stage company that's still struggling to survive financially, for example. Local contexts really matter. So our project took place in London with companies that had all set their goals in London. They'd come to London to build their businesses. In some cases, at least 40 of the companies came from all around the world to join the program. But we've had many discussions now. Rose and the team are continuing these discussions around how you pick up a program like ours and take it to other countries with very, very different contexts. So the incubator accelerator community around that particular country might work differently. Links with schools might be easier. Many, many things that mean you could adapt the program to join that triangle up. So for us, what we would have always liked to have done was really develop the pilot element, which needed a lot more money and a lot more resource to enable the users to be involved in this whole co-design process. Other countries are set up for that to happen much more easily. And then the final element of our design-based research is actually the work of one of Rose and I have a PhD student, Anissa Moani, who has submitted her thesis and should be examined in the next month or so. But she has picked something which we're calling the facets of an evidence-informed learning technology enterprise. And Anissa worked in a study where she actually worked alongside the companies and selected from the companies in the program and did a deep design-based research study which looked at what does it mean to be an evidence-led learning technology enterprise, and what are the facets that the research team initially thought looked important from their perspective of having worked with all of these companies. Took several cycles to develop these constructs, and she's developed a tool that now can be used to help diagnose edtech companies' research capacities in that sense. And the 6 facets or subconstructs that Anissa's work has revealed. And there is a hierarchy here, and at the top is the one that is really the most important. And this won't be surprising if you look at management literature on most things to do with organizational development inside companies. But the leadership vision is crucial. Leaders need to know enough about the research methods and some of the techniques and language of research to enable their organization to have a learning culture, keep the sense of purpose for the organization aligned with the educational vision, encourage and nurture the teamwork necessary for all of the members of the organization to understand the role that research plays in building their educational technology. There needs to be capacity in the company to actually do the research, ideally. So it isn't enough to just outsource. You need to have some understanding, because there's an awful lot of research that you need to be doing iteratively throughout, that outsourcing will then not allow you to develop that skill set. And then most crucially, there's absolutely no point having the other 5 subconstructs if you don't have an action orientation. So an action orientation means with all of that in place, you do something about it. You actually act on the research findings in ways that develop your product towards those impact goals. So very important that at the end of it, there is action. So from Anissa's study, we've got this LT framework, and it can be used in 3 ways. So it's a diagnostic. It's helpful for researchers who are going to work and support edtech companies and innovations and incubators, accelerators, to even ask the question around, is the edtech being in a position to be evidence informed? It's capacity building. So what is it that, which of those facets need to be developed, and therefore how might you provide resource or support into a company to develop those facets? And ultimately, and this is where the investors come in, and this is where the users come in, and that's going back to that wider ecosystem. If you can demonstrate that you are an evidence-informed learning technology enterprise, it builds immense trust in the system. So from government's perspective, from investors' perspective, from teachers' perspective, when we talk about investing, we talk about giving something. When a teacher takes a new product or innovation, they invest their time. That's to be valued. That's a really valuable commodity in this world. So in all of the system, we are investing in these companies' products one way or another. does it give us that extra mark that suggests that this particular product is more can be trusted more? One of my goals, and I know one of Rose Luckin's goals, is, you know, all of these educational technology companies and products have, you know, usually very beautifully constructed web pages that draw you in, lure you in. Where's that little button that says our research evidence? And will we get to a day where everybody thinks that having that evidence available in its forms for different people, so it might look different for parents than it does for a government or policymaker, but having that evidence is really where we want to be heading. So let me come towards the end, and I'd like to just sort of get to the call to action, because I'm certainly very action oriented, and as a result of my action, University College London is involved in a really interesting network across Europe that I'm going to tell you about, and the call to action is obviously to join it and become part of it. But if I just say a little bit on this day where we are focused in on higher education and what the higher education institution's role includes when it comes to evaluating the impact of technologies. The really important thing is, obviously our main business is doing research, and, you know, in the learning sciences and in the development of technologies and the methodologies that we use to evaluate educational technology, that's the bread and butter day job, and in a way everybody expects that's what universities do. Interestingly, some universities are more outwardly facing than others. Some are more interested in having research impact and engagement. That's a role I hold in my own university, where we really encourage researchers from the very conception to be thinking about how they can reach potential beneficiaries of their research. And for us, trying to find ways in which they can take their what might be quite sort of theoretical innovations to an audience that can then really turn that into something practical and beneficial for society is really key to that role. We train across all the universities in the world. We train and support the lifelong professional learning of millions of teachers around the world. And that means if you're ultimately looking to work and support teachers, the conduit to teachers in training and teachers in their professional learning is through university collaboration and partnership. And that happens in a whole host of ways. So right now there's collaborations going on between universities with masters and doctoral students, being part of design sprints with companies, giving feedback, evaluating, you know, finding those really close links whereby we can co-design and co-develop with the companies. Obviously, the role of teachers in that is a really critical one. The whole design and implementation approach and evaluation is something that we obviously can support with. And we have our own incubators and accelerators, as in Educate, which is really looking towards growing the sustainable solutions that come out of the different digital innovations. And it's in this role that UCL partnered with IE, the host, one of the hosts of Enlighted, with Oulu University of Applied Sciences in Finland and the Catholic University in Leuven in Belgium, to form the European EdTech Network. And this is currently an Erasmus funded project. We have a website which is on the screen there. It is open to all to join. And this is a community of higher education institutions with educational technology entrepreneurs and innovators, schools, colleges, anyone who is interested in really making a stronger link with universities who are working in this area. So if you're going to make a start and approach a university to look at opportunities for collaboration, what we're bringing together for you is a place where the door's already ajar. So we would urge you to have a look at the website. We produce a whole host of resources. We have 3 different types of content. We have our knowledge base, which are syntheses of research in key areas that we think are relevant to an entrepreneurial audience. So if you want a quick digest on a topic, for example, artificial intelligence, or how we think about well-being, some of the things that are very difficult to find metrics for and measure, have a look at the knowledge base, because that's growing all the time. We have case studies, and they are our examples examples of where we at universities have worked in collaboration with industry and school college partners to develop and design and co-design different educational technologies. You'll see a case study around the Educate program on there, which is an interesting one. And you also see quite a number of case studies from IE University in Madrid around the ways that they're building technological innovations into the work that they're doing. And in Leuven, they have some very cutting-edge technologies, very interesting technologies in robotics. And between our four partners, we really try to address the span of expertise that might be useful for the sector. Finally, we also have a very engaging set of talking heads, if you like, of different people in the field who are giving perspectives and views around educational technology as a lighter sort of digest. So urge you to have a look at the website and join. It doesn't cost anything. If you're in a university, the door is wide open for you to become a partner, and this is a network that is gaining increasing interest around the world. So we are coming to the end now. I'm glancing across at our board, which is looking very interesting, and I can see very interesting to see some of the careful changes of words there on there while we've been in this workshop. So we will find a way to snapshot that, and I will include it in my slides so that it goes out to everybody at the end of the session. But I've got time. I mean, we have time for Q&A. I'm going to see if there's anything there that has come up. Otherwise, please post questions. It's hard for me to see this chat. I'm very sorry. It's a tiny window on my screen. But I'm really happy to follow up with anyone after the session where it might be easier to have a more informal chat. Notice it's got dark around the outside now. But there's my contact details. And I'll finish by saying thank you very much. Thanks to those of you who contributed inside the workshop to our Miro board. And I will leave that link open for a few days in case you want to share it with others, and let's see how that grows. But we will snapshot it and put it into the slide deck, which will be shared after the event. So if there are no questions, I am going to, let me double check if I can see. I will say, wish you well wherever you are in the world. Please do contact me on email if there's anything you want to follow up on. If you want to find out anything more about Anissa's doctoral work, the ETN, our Educate project, or anything else that might have sparked something in you, please email me. And I really hope that this time next year, we will be back in Madrid and I will be doing another version of this, which will have a lot more hands-on and practical activity. But thank you for your patience, especially with the tech, which didn't quite work as we anticipated. And have a nice evening, everybody. Thank you very much indeed.